The blood on her fingertip had long since dried when Sarah Dawson realized she had been using cactus needles to mend her father's shirt for the better part of 3 months. She sat on the weathered porch of their small ranch house outside Verde, Nevada, the August heat of 1882 shimmering across the sagebrush landscape, and wondered if other women her age were reduced to such desperate measures, or if poverty had chosen her family specifically for its cruelest attentions. Nathan Jarrett saw her there as he rode past on his way back from checking fence lines on the neighboring property, his horse kicking up dust that glowed amber in the late afternoon sun. He had passed the Dawson place 100 times in the 2 years since he had started working at the Martinez Ranch, but something about the way she sat so still, her dark hair falling forward as she bent over her work, made him slow his mount to a walk. He could see from the road that her fingers moved with practiced precision, though there was a tension in her shoulders that spoke of pain or frustration, or perhaps both. She looked up as his shadow fell across the parched ground between them, and for a moment their eyes met with an intensity that surprised them both. Hers were the color of creek water in spring, clear and brown with flecks of green, and they held a pride that made her lift her chin, even as he could see the poverty written in every threadbare corner of her dress, and the peeling paint of the house behind her. "Afternoon, miss," Nathan said, touching the brim of his hat. He was 24, tall and lean from years of hard work, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of storm clouds. His voice carried the rough kindness of a man who had known hardship himself and learned not to judge others for their circumstances. "Good afternoon," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the way her heart had suddenly begun to beat faster. She was 22 and had lived in Nevada her entire life, watching the silver mines boom and bust, watching her father lose everything when the wrong investments crumbled like the dry earth beneath their feet. She had learned to be wary of strangers, especially men who looked at her too long, but there was something different in this cowboy's gaze, something that felt less like hunger and more like recognition. "Hot day for sewing," Nathan observed, not quite ready to ride on, though he could not have explained why. Sarah glanced down at the shirt in her lap, then back up at him with a hint of defiance. "Hot day for everything. Work does not stop just because the sun decides to be unforgiving." He smiled at that, a slow expression that transformed his weathered face. "I reckon that is the truth." He hesitated, then asked, "Are those cactus needles you are using?" Her cheeks flushed, but she did not look away. "They are. You find that amusing?" "No, miss. I find that resourceful." He shifted in his saddle, leather creaking. "My mother used to say that a person's character shows clearest in what they do when no one is watching and they have run out of easier options." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of shame she had been carrying without fully acknowledging it. "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was. She passed 4 years back, but I still hear her voice sometimes, telling me to stand up straight or mind my manners." Nathan's expression softened with memory. "She would have liked your resourcefulness. She would have said you were the kind of woman who finds a way." They talked for 20 minutes there in the fading light, him still mounted, her still seated with her mending in her lap. He learned that she lived with her father, that her mother had died of fever when Sarah was 16, that they survived on what little they could coax from their failing ranch, and what she could earn taking in sewing from the few families in Verde who could afford such services. She learned that he had come to Nevada from Colorado, that he worked for Miguel Martinez raising cattle, that he sent most of his wages back to his younger sister in Denver, who was trying to make her way as a schoolteacher. When he finally rode on, promising to greet her if he passed by again, Sarah found herself unable to concentrate on her mending. She pricked her finger 3 more times on the cactus needles before giving up and going inside to help her father prepare their meager dinner. Nathan did pass by again and again after that. Sometimes he stopped to talk, sometimes he merely waved, but Sarah found herself listening for the sound of hoofbeats every afternoon around the same time. Her father, George Dawson, noticed and said nothing, though his weathered face would crease with concern when he saw his daughter watching the road with an expression he had not seen since before her mother died. 3 weeks after their first conversation, Nathan dismounted and tied his horse to the porch rail, climbing the steps with the careful movements of a man who wanted to be invited rather than presumed welcome. Sarah had just finished hemming a skirt for the banker's wife, and she set it aside as he approached. "I have been thinking," Nathan said without preamble, "about those cactus needles." Sarah felt her defenses rise. "I told you I managed just fine. I did not mean any offense." He held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I just kept thinking how those needles must hurt your fingers something fierce, and how wrong it seems that a woman with your skill should have to suffer for want of proper tools." "Many things in this world are wrong," Sarah said quietly. "That does not mean they can be fixed." Nathan looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression, a decision being made. "The thing is, Miss Dawson, I have been saving my wages for more than a year now. I've been saving for something important, though I had not quite figured out what that important thing was until recently." Sarah's heart was beating so hard she was certain he could hear it. "I do not understand." "I would like your permission to ride to Carson City and buy you a proper set of sewing needles. Pins too, and thread if you need it, and whatever else a seamstress requires to do her work without bleeding every day." She stood up so quickly that her mending basket tipped over, spilling thread and fabric scraps across the porch. "I cannot accept such a gift. It would not be proper, and besides, Carson City is more than 40 miles from here. That is a journey of days, not hours." 43 miles, Nathan said. "I already checked. And as for proper, I would ask your father's permission first, naturally. But Miss Dawson, Sarah, if I may be so bold, I have thought of little else but you and those cactus needles for 3 weeks now. It seems to me that when a man cannot stop thinking about a woman's happiness, that tells him something worth knowing." Sarah stared at him, her mind racing through a dozen thoughts at once. She barely knew this man. She had no right to accept such a gift. She should send him away immediately. And yet, the thought of having real needles again, of not having to extract spines from her aching fingers every night, of being able to work without pain, it was almost overwhelming in its appeal. But more than that, far more than that, was the way he looked at her, as if her comfort mattered, as if she mattered in a way no one had made her feel since her mother died. "Why?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You do not know me. You owe me nothing." Nathan took a step closer, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the absolute sincerity in his expression. "I know that you sit on this porch every day mending clothes for people who probably do not pay you half what you are worth. I know that you smile at your father when he comes out to check on you, even though I can see the worry in your eyes. I know that you use cactus needles because you cannot afford proper ones and that you do not complain about it, not once in all the times we have talked. And I know that every time I ride past here and see you, I feel something I have not felt in a long time, something that feels like hope." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. "I do not need your pity. Good, because I am not offering any. I am offering admiration and, if you will allow it, courtship. The needles are not charity, Sarah. They are an investment in the hope that you might consider letting me call on you properly. And that maybe, just maybe, you feel even a fraction of what I am feeling right now." She looked down at her hands, at the small scars and calluses that marked them, at the faint traces of blood where today's work had taken its toll. Then she looked back up at Nathan Jarrett, this cowboy who had somehow seen past her poverty to the person beneath it, and she made a decision that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "You should speak to my father," she said softly. "He is in the barn." The smile that broke across Nathan's face was like sunrise, warm and full of promise. "I will do that right now, if you do not mind waiting here." Sarah watched him stride toward the barn, his long legs eating up the distance, and she pressed a hand to her chest, as if she could slow her racing heart through sheer force of will. She could hear the murmur of voices from inside the barn, though not the words themselves, and she busied herself picking up the contents of her spilled basket to keep from pacing. When Nathan emerged 20 minutes later, her father was with him, and George Dawson's expression was complex, mixing concern with something that might have been approval. He was 58, worn down by disappointment and hard work, but his eyes were still sharp when he looked at his daughter. "This young man has asked my permission to court you," George said without preamble. "He has also informed me of his intention to ride to Carson City to purchase sewing supplies, which I told him was both generous and entirely unnecessary." "But not forbidden?" Sarah asked, looking between the two men, her father sighed. "Not forbidden, though I want it understood that such a gift creates no obligation on your part, Sarah. You are free to accept his courtship or decline it as you see fit, regardless of any needles or pins or whatever else he might bring back." Nathan nodded. "I gave my word on that, sir, and I meant it." George studied the younger man for a long moment, then turned to his daughter. "He seems honest, at least. That is more than can be said for most. But you be careful, Sarah. A kind gesture does not always mean a kind heart, though I am willing to give him the benefit of the doubt for now." "Thank you, Papa," Sarah said, and she meant it. Her father had every reason to be suspicious of strangers, to protect what little they had left. His willingness to let Nathan try was an act of faith she knew cost him something. Nathan left shortly after with a promise to return in 3 days, 4 at most, depending on the roads and the availability of supplies in Carson City. Sarah watched him ride away until he was nothing but a distant speck on the horizon. And then she sat back down with her mending and promptly stabbed herself with a cactus needle, because she could not concentrate on anything but the strange, fluttering sensation in her chest. That night, as she lay in her small room listening to the coyotes howl in the distance, Sarah let herself imagine what it might be like to have real needles again. But more than that, she imagined what it might be like to be courted by Nathan Jarrett, to have someone who looked at her the way he did, with such open admiration and genuine interest. She had nearly given up on the idea of marriage, assuming that poverty had placed such dreams beyond her reach. But now, unexpectedly, impossibly, a door had opened, and she was terrified of how much she wanted to walk through it. Nathan rode out before dawn the next morning, after informing Miguel Martinez that he needed a few days for personal business, and receiving his employer's somewhat bemused blessing. Miguel was a good man, fair and understanding, and he had noticed the way his best ranch hand had been distracted lately. When Nathan explained, somewhat awkwardly, that he was riding to Carson City to buy sewing supplies for a young woman he hoped to court, Miguel had laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. "Love makes fools of us all," Miguel had said in his accented English. "But at least you are an honest fool. Go, and may God speed your journey." The ride to Carson City was long and hot, the Nevada summer showing no mercy to man or beast. Nathan stopped frequently to water his horse at creeks and springs, pushing forward with the single-minded determination of a man on a mission. He spent the first night under the stars, too restless to sleep much, his mind full of Sarah's face and the hope he had seen flicker in her eyes when he had spoken of courtship. He reached Carson City by midday on the second day, dusty and tired but driven by purpose. The capital city was far larger than Verde, with actual streets and shops and the bustle of commerce that came with being a governmental hub. Nathan made his way to a mercantile he had heard other ranch hands mention, a place that supposedly carried goods from San Francisco and was known for having a comprehensive inventory. The shopkeeper, a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, looked up from his ledger as Nathan entered. "Help you. I need sewing supplies," Nathan said. "A full set. Needles of all sizes, pins, thread in various colors, scissors, thimbles, whatever a professional seamstress would need." The shopkeeper's eyebrows rose. "That is quite an order. Are you outfitting a shop?" "No, sir, it is a gift." Nathan pulled out the roll of bills he had saved so carefully, money that represented months of dawn to dusk labor. "I want the best quality you have. This is for someone who does fine work and deserves fine tools." Something in Nathan's expression must have communicated his sincerity because the shopkeeper's businesslike demeanor softened slightly. "I see. Well, let me show you what we have in stock. I just received a shipment from San Francisco last week, actually. Some very fine English needles, steel pins that will not rust or bend easily, thread imported from France." For the next hour, Nathan learned more about sewing supplies than he had ever imagined existed. He selected needles in a dozen sizes, from fine ones for delicate work to heavier ones for leather and canvas. He chose pins with glass heads that would not melt if accidentally touched by a hot iron. He picked out thread in every color the shop carried, thinking of how Sarah might need variety for her work. He added a pair of sharp scissors, a leather thimble, a pin cushion shaped like a tomato, a measuring tape, and a beautiful wooden sewing box with multiple compartments to hold everything. The total came to more than he had planned to spend, eating up nearly all his savings, but when Nathan looked at the assembled supplies, all he could think about was Sarah's face when she saw them. He paid without hesitation and asked the shopkeeper to pack everything carefully for the journey back. "This is for someone special," the shopkeeper observed as he wrapped each item with meticulous care. "Yes, sir, she is," Nathan agreed, and saying it out loud made it feel even more true. He spent that night in a boarding house, the sewing box and supplies secured carefully in his room, and allowed himself the luxury of a real bed and a hot meal before starting the return journey at first light. The ride back seemed longer somehow, perhaps because he was impatient to see Sarah's reaction, perhaps because the weight of the supplies made him more conscious of what they represented. This was not just a gift. This was a declaration, a statement of intent, a bridge between his life and hers. He stopped at a creek late on the second day to rest his horse, and found himself opening the sewing box just to look at its contents again. Each needle gleamed in the fading light. Each spool of thread was wound tight and perfect, and he tried to imagine Sarah's hands holding them, using them to create the beautiful work he had seen her produce, even with the most inadequate tools. That was when he realized he was already in love with her, had been falling since that first afternoon when he had seen her sitting on her porch with such determined dignity. The needles were not a strategy to win her affection. They were simply an expression of what he already felt, a need to ease her burden because her pain had somehow become his own. He reached Verde on the afternoon of the fourth day, sunburned and sore, but filled with an excitement that made him forget his exhaustion. He rode straight to the Dawson ranch, his heart pounding as the small house came into view. Sarah was not on the porch, and for a moment he felt a sharp stab of disappointment. Then the front door opened and she stepped out, shading her eyes against the sun, and the smile that lit her face when she recognized him was worth every mile he had ridden. "You came back," she called out, and there was such genuine joy in her voice that Nathan felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I told you I would," he said, dismounting and pulling the sewing box from his saddlebag. "I have something for you." Sarah came down the porch steps slowly, her eyes fixed on the polished wooden box in his hands. When she reached him, she stopped, seeming almost afraid to touch it. "Is that what I think it is?" "Open it," Nathan said softly, holding it out to her. With trembling fingers, Sarah lifted the lid, and Nathan watched her face as she took in the contents. Her mouth opened in a small O of surprise, and tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. She touched the needles reverently, ran her fingers over the spools of thread, lifted out the scissors with their gleaming blades and perfect weight. "Nathan," she whispered, and his name had never sounded so sweet as it did in that moment. "This is too much. This must have cost a fortune." "It cost what it cost, and it was worth every penny to see your face right now." He set the box down on the porch step and took her hands in his, feeling the small scars and calluses, the evidence of her hard work and determination. "Sarah Dawson, these last few days riding to Carson City and back, all I could think about was you. Not just about bringing you these supplies, but about who you are and who I want to be when I am around you. I know we have not known each other long, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life than I am about wanting to court you properly." Sarah looked up at him through her tears, and her smile was radiant. "I thought about you too. Every hour you were gone, I thought about you and wondered if you were safe, and if you would really come back. And I realized that somewhere in these past few weeks, you have become the best part of my days." Nathan felt something in his chest expand, a warmth that had nothing to do with the Nevada heat. "Does that mean you will let me call on you, properly with your father's blessing and all the respect you deserve?" "Yes," Sarah said simply. "Yes, Nathan, I would like that very much." He wanted to kiss her then, wanted it so badly his hands shook, but he knew it was too soon, too fast, despite the intensity of what he felt. Instead, he squeezed her hands gently and released them, stepping back to a more proper distance even as everything in him protested the space between them. George Dawson emerged from the house at that moment, drawn by the sound of voices, and his expression when he saw his daughter's tears and the sewing box was complex. "I see you made good on your promise." "Yes, sir." "Rode 43 miles there and 43 miles back, and I would do it again gladly." Nathan met the older man's eyes steadily. "Your daughter is worth any effort, Mr. Dawson. I hope I will have many opportunities to prove that to both of you." George studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I suppose you should stay for supper then. It is not much, but Sarah makes a fine stew, and we can at least offer you a meal after such a journey." The meal was simple but delicious, and Nathan ate with the appreciation of a man who had been living on hardtack and jerky for days. But more than the food, he savored the conversation. The easy way Sarah talked about her sewing projects and her hopes for expanding her business now that she had proper tools. The dry humor her father displayed when he spoke of the challenges of maintaining a failing ranch, the feeling of being welcomed into their small family circle. After dinner, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple across the desert sky, Nathan sat on the porch with Sarah while her father discreetly remained inside. They talked about everything and nothing, their conversation flowing with the ease of people who had been friends for years rather than weeks. Sarah told him about growing up in Nevada, about her mother's death, and how she had learned to be strong when strength was the only option. Nathan spoke of Colorado and his family, of the hard decisions that had brought him west, of his dreams for the future. "I want my own place someday," he confessed. "Not a huge spread, but something I can build and be proud of. A ranch where I can raise cattle and maybe horses, where I can put down real roots instead of just working for someone else's dream." "That sounds wonderful," Sarah said softly. "Everyone deserves a dream to work toward." "What about you?" Nathan asked. "What do you dream about?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, looking out at the darkening landscape. "I dream about security, about not wondering if we will have enough to eat or whether we will lose this place when the next payment comes due. But more than that, I dream about belonging to something bigger than just survival, about having a purpose beyond just getting through each day." She turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the first stars. "Does that sound foolish?" "No," Nathan said firmly. "It sounds human, and for what it is worth, I think you deserve all of that and more." He left shortly after, promising to return the next day if his work schedule allowed, and rode back to the Martinez ranch with his heart full of a contentment he had not felt in years. Miguel took one look at his face and laughed, saying something in Spanish that Nathan did not quite catch, but that sounded approving. The courtship that followed was conducted under the watchful eye of George Dawson and the informal supervision of half of Verde, as news of the cowboy who had ridden 43 miles to buy sewing supplies for Sarah Dawson spread through the small town with the speed of wildfire. People who had barely acknowledged Sarah before suddenly wanted to talk to her, to hear the story, to see the famous sewing box that represented such devotion. Sarah found the attention both flattering and uncomfortable, but Nathan handled it with good-natured patience, neither encouraging the gossip nor allowing it to interfere with their growing relationship. He came to call on her 3 or 4 times a week, whenever his work permitted, and they spent long evenings on the porch talking about their lives and their hopes, and discovering the 1,000 small ways in which they were compatible. Sarah learned that Nathan was unfailingly honest, sometimes to the point of bluntness, but that his honesty came from a place of respect rather than cruelty. She discovered that he had a quiet sense of humor and a deep loyalty to those he cared about, that he was patient with animals and kind to children, that he treated her father with genuine respect rather than the condescension many younger men might have shown. Nathan learned that Sarah was far stronger than she looked, that her gentleness masked a core of steel forged by hardship and loss. He saw how hard she worked, taking on any sewing project offered to her and completing each one with meticulous care. He watched her nurse her father through a bout of summer fever with tireless devotion, and he saw the way she quietly helped other families in Verde who were struggling, sharing what little she had because she understood their desperation. He fell more in love with her every day. 2 months into their courtship, Nathan asked Sarah to accompany him to the town social, a monthly gathering where families came together for music and dancing and the simple pleasure of community. Sarah had not attended in over a year, too embarrassed by her worn dresses and shabby shoes, but Nathan would not accept her refusal. "I do not care what you wear," he said firmly. "You are the most beautiful woman in Verde, and everyone knows it. Besides, I want to dance with you, and I am tired of imagining what it might be like." So Sarah used her new sewing supplies to remake one of her mother's old dresses, taking it apart and reconstructing it to fit her frame, adding lace she had carefully preserved for years and small touches that transformed it from outdated to charming. When Nathan arrived to escort her to the social, held in the largest barn in town, his face when he saw her made every hour of work worthwhile. "Sarah," he breathed, "you are absolutely stunning." She blushed and took his offered arm, and together they walked into the social with their heads held high. The evening was magical in the way that simple pleasures can be when shared with the right person. They danced until Sarah's feet ached. They laughed at the antics of children chasing each other between the adults. They ate pie and drank lemonade and existed in a bubble of happiness that felt almost impossible given the hardships of their daily lives. During a slower dance, Nathan pulled Sarah closer than was strictly proper, and spoke softly into her ear. "I need to tell you something." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" "I have been offered a position as foreman at the Martinez Ranch. Miguel is getting older and wants to focus more on his family, less on the day-to-day operations. The job comes with better pay and a small house on the property." He pulled back slightly so he could see her face. "I am telling you this because I have been thinking about our future." "Our future, Sarah, together." She stared at him, her mind racing. "Together, I love you," Nathan said, and the words hung in the air between them, simple and profound. "I have loved you since I saw you sitting on that porch with cactus needles, refusing to give up despite everything. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you make me want to be a better man. And if you feel even a fraction of what I feel, then I want to start building that dream I told you about. Not someday, but now. With you." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes for the second time since meeting Nathan Jarrett, and she realized that he had somehow become essential to her, as necessary as air or water. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I started loving you the day you said, using cactus needles was resourceful instead of pitiful." Nathan's smile was brilliant, and right there in the middle of the dance floor, surrounded by half the town, he kissed her for the first time. It was a brief kiss, chaste and proper, but it sealed something between them that had been building since their first conversation. The engagement was announced the following week, and if some in Verdi thought it was too fast, too impulsive, they kept their opinions to themselves in the face of the obvious devotion the couple shared. George Dawson gave his blessing with tears in his eyes, pulling Nathan aside to tell him that he was entrusting him with the most precious thing in his life, and that he had better treat her accordingly. "I will, sir," Nathan promised. "I will spend every day of my life making sure she never regrets choosing me." The wedding was planned for October, after the worst of the summer heat had passed, but before the winter cold set in. In the weeks leading up to it, Nathan threw himself into preparing the small foreman's house for his bride. He repaired the roof and replaced broken windows. He built new furniture and painted the walls. He created a space specifically for Sarah's sewing work with good light and plenty of storage for her supplies. Sarah, meanwhile, used her new needles and thread to create her wedding dress, a simple but elegant gown in cream-colored fabric that she had saved for months to afford. Every stitch was perfect, every seam precise, and as she worked on it in the evenings, she marveled at how much her life had changed in just a few months. From desperation and cactus needles to hope and love and a future that seemed almost too bright to believe in. The wedding took place on a perfect October afternoon, the heat finally broken by the approach of autumn. The ceremony was held in Verdi's small church, officiated by the traveling preacher who passed through once a month. Sarah walked down the aisle on her father's arm, and when she reached Nathan and saw the love in his eyes, she knew without doubt that she was making the right choice. They spoke their vows in clear, steady voices, promising to love and honor each other through whatever challenges life might bring. When Nathan slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, a ring he had saved for months to buy, Sarah felt a completeness she had never experienced before. They were no longer two people struggling alone against the world. They were partners, united in purpose and love. The reception was a community affair, with families bringing food and drinks to share, with music and dancing and celebration that lasted into the evening. George Dawson danced with his daughter and whispered that her mother would have been so proud, and Sarah held her father tight, grateful that he would not be alone in the failing ranch house because Nathan had already made arrangements to hire someone to help with the work and keep George company. As the sun set and the celebration began to wind down, Nathan and Sarah slipped away to their new home. Nathan carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing at the tradition, and then they stood together in the main room, suddenly shy despite all the time they had spent together. "Welcome home, Mrs. Jarrett," Nathan said softly. "It feels like a dream," Sarah admitted. "A wonderful dream that I am afraid to wake up from." Nathan pulled her close, his arms strong and warm around her. "Then let us make sure we never wake up. Let us build a life so good, so real that dreams pale in comparison." That night, in the privacy of their small house, they became husband and wife in full truth. Nathan was gentle and patient, mindful of Sarah's inexperience, and Sarah discovered that physical intimacy with someone you loved was nothing like the vague, frightening stories she had heard from other women. It was beautiful and profound, a joining that went beyond mere bodies to touch something deeper. Afterward, lying tangled together in their new bed, Sarah traced the scar above Nathan's eyebrow and asked him how he had gotten it. He told her about a childhood accident involving a horse and a fence, and she shared the story of how she had broken her wrist falling out of a tree when she was 10. They talked and laughed and made love again as the moon rose outside their window, and Sarah thought that she had never been happier in her entire life. The first months of marriage brought adjustments and discoveries as they learned to live together, to navigate the small conflicts and compromises that came with sharing a life. Nathan worked long hours as foreman, managing the ranch hands and overseeing operations, but he always came home to Sarah with energy for conversation and affection. Sarah established her sewing business in earnest, word of her skill spreading beyond Verdi to nearby towns, and she found herself busier than ever with commissions. They developed routines and rituals, small things that became the foundation of their shared life. Nathan would bring her coffee every morning before heading out to work. Sarah would have dinner ready when he returned, and they would eat together, sharing the details of their days. On Sundays, they visited George Dawson and helped with whatever work the ranch required, Nathan refusing to let his father-in-law struggle alone. Winter came, bringing cold that was sharp but nothing like the brutal temperatures Nathan had known in Colorado. They huddled together by their fire in the evenings, Sarah sewing while Nathan read aloud from whatever books they could acquire, their voices and hands creating an intimacy that felt sacred. It was in January, 4 months after their wedding, that Sarah realized her monthly courses had not come. She waited another week to be sure, then another, before finally sharing her suspicion with Nathan. His reaction was everything she could have hoped for, pure joy mixed with a tenderness that made her cry. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, as if he could not quite believe it. "Sarah, we are going to be parents. Are you happy?" she asked, though his expression made the question unnecessary. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Nathan said, pulling her into his arms with exquisite care as if she had suddenly become fragile. "You have given me so much already, and now this. I feel like the luckiest man alive." The pregnancy progressed smoothly despite Sarah's initial fears. Her father wept when they told him, overcome with joy at the prospect of a grandchild. Miguel Martinez, who had become a friend to both of them, celebrated by giving them a beautiful handmade cradle that had been in his family for generations. The women of Verde, who had watched Sarah's transformation from poverty to happiness with varying degrees of envy and genuine pleasure, threw her a small party and presented her with baby clothes they had sewn collectively. Nathan became almost comically protective, worrying about Sarah's health and insisting she not work too hard. Sarah, who had never been pampered in her life, found his concern both touching and occasionally frustrating, especially when he tried to prevent her from doing her sewing work. "I am pregnant, not dying," she informed him one evening when he attempted to take a project away from her. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time while still doing their work. I am not going to break." "I know," Nathan said, though he looked unconvinced. "I just want to take care of you." "You do take care of me," Sarah said more gently, taking his hand and placing it on her growing belly. "But part of taking care of me is trusting me to know my own limits. I promise I will rest when I need to. But I also need to work, Nathan. Not just for the money, though that certainly helps, but because my sewing gives me purpose and pride." He understood, or at least tried to, and he backed off somewhat, though Sarah often caught him watching her with concern when he thought she was not looking. She found it endearing rather than annoying, this evidence of how much he loved her. Spring arrived with wildflowers blooming across the desert, splashes of color against the muted browns and greens of the landscape. Sarah's belly grew round and prominent, and she had to alter all her dresses to accommodate her changing shape. She felt the baby move inside her, small flutters at first that gradually became strong kicks and rolls, and she would place Nathan's hand against her stomach so he could feel it too. "He is strong," Nathan would say, his face filled with wonder, or she, Sarah would remind him. "Our daughter might be just as strong." "True. And if she is anything like her mother, she will be strong enough to move mountains." The baby came in early June, on a day so hot that Sarah thought she might melt even before the labor pains began. Nathan rode frantically to fetch the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Henderson, who had delivered half the babies in the county, and then he was banished from the bedroom while the women took over. The labor was long and difficult, lasting well into the night. Nathan paced outside, tortured by Sarah's cries of pain and his own helplessness. George Dawson sat with him, offering what comfort he could, and Miguel arrived at some point with whiskey that Nathan drank gratefully, though it did nothing to settle his nerves. Finally, just before dawn, a new cry joined Sarah's, the thin, outraged wail of a newborn. Nathan froze, hardly daring to breathe, and then Mrs. Henderson opened the door with a tired smile. "You have a son, Mr. Jarrett, a big, healthy boy with a fine set of lungs, and your wife did beautifully, though she is exhausted." Nathan pushed past her into the room, his eyes seeking Sarah. She lay propped up on pillows, her hair damp with sweat and her face pale with exhaustion, but she had never looked more beautiful to him. In her arms, wrapped in a blanket, was a tiny red-faced infant with a shock of dark hair. "Nathan," Sarah said softly, and her smile was radiant despite her fatigue. "Come meet your son." He approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at the baby with tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "He is perfect. Sarah, he is absolutely perfect." "We need to name him," Sarah said, touching the baby's tiny hand with one finger. "What should we call him?" They had discussed names endlessly during the pregnancy, going back and forth without ever settling on anything definite. But now, looking at his son's face, Nathan knew exactly what felt right. "William," he said firmly. "William George Jarrett, after your father." George, who had entered quietly behind Nathan, made a choked sound. You do not have to do that. We want to, Sarah said, looking at her father with love. You have been our rock, Papa. It would honor us to name our son after you. The old man's eyes filled with tears and he nodded, unable to speak. Baby William was a demanding but healthy infant, and Nathan and Sarah navigated the exhausting early weeks of parenthood with a mixture of terror and joy. Nathan helped with everything, from changing diapers to walking the floor at night when William cried, refusing to let Sarah bear the burden alone. You need your rest, he insisted. Let me handle this. But Sarah would often wake anyway and join him, the three of them forming a small, sleepy family unit in the dark hours of the night. She nursed William while Nathan held her, and in those quiet moments, Sarah reflected on how far she had come from the desperate woman using cactus needles on a failing ranch. As William grew from infant to baby, his personality began to emerge. He was cheerful and curious, with Nathan's gray eyes and Sarah's expressive face. He laughed easily and seemed fascinated by everything around him, reaching for objects with chubby hands and babbling in a language only he understood. Nathan proved to be a devoted father, playing with William for hours, and showing a patience Sarah had not known he possessed. He built toys and told elaborate stories and taught their son to love the outdoors, carrying him around the ranch and pointing out horses and cattle, and the hawks that circled overhead. Sarah returned to her sewing work gradually, setting up a space where she could watch William while she worked. She found that motherhood had not diminished her skill, but rather given her a deeper appreciation for the practical concerns of clothing children. She began specializing in children's garments, creating durable pieces with thoughtful details that made her work even more sought after. Life settled into a new rhythm, busier and more complex than before but deeply satisfying. Nathan continued to excel as foreman, and Miguel began talking about eventually selling him a portion of the ranch so he could begin building the spread of his own he had always dreamed of. Sarah's sewing business brought in steady income that they saved carefully, building toward that future. When William was 18 months old, Sarah discovered she was pregnant again. Nathan's reaction was the same mixture of joy and immediate concern, though this time Sarah was more confident in her ability to handle both pregnancy and motherhood while continuing her work. We are going to need a bigger house, Nathan observed, looking around their increasingly crowded space. I know, Sarah agreed, but that is a good problem to have, is it not? A year and a half ago, I would not have dared dream of having one child, let alone two. The second pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because Sarah knew what to expect or perhaps because her body was simply more prepared. She worked almost until the day she went into labor, this time on a mild autumn afternoon that reminded her of her wedding day. This baby came faster, a girl with Sarah's coloring and a temperament that seemed calmer than her brother's had been. They named her Margaret after Nathan's mother, and Nathan held his daughter with such tenderness that Sarah fell in love with him all over again. 2 children, he marveled. We have 2 perfect children. We do, Sarah agreed, watching him with Margaret while William toddled around their feet, demanding attention. We are blessed beyond measure. The years that followed brought both challenges and triumphs. There were hard winters when money was tight and spring seemed impossibly far away. There were illnesses that terrified them, though fortunately nothing serious. There were disagreements and frustrations, the inevitable conflicts that came with building a life together. But through it all, there was love. The deep, abiding love that had begun with cactus needles and a 43-mile ride had only grown stronger with time and testing. Nathan and Sarah learned to support each other through difficulties, to celebrate each other's successes, to parent together with a united front. When William was 5 and Margaret 3, Miguel finally made the offer Nathan had been hoping for, selling him 200 acres at a price they could manage with their savings and a loan from the bank. It was not a huge spread, but it was theirs, and Nathan threw himself into building it up with the same determination he had shown in everything else. Sarah continued her sewing, her reputation spreading far enough that she sometimes received commissions from as far away as Virginia City. She trained 2 local women to help with simpler projects, creating a small business that provided income for multiple families. The wooden sewing box Nathan had brought her from Carson City still held pride of place in her workroom, and she used those needles every day, treasuring them not just for their quality, but for what they represented. George Dawson remained a constant presence in their lives, a doting grandfather who spent hours with his grandchildren and helped Nathan with ranch work when his aging body permitted. He lived to see William start school and Margaret learn to ride, and when he passed peacefully in his sleep one winter night, he did so knowing that his daughter was happy and secure. Sarah grieved her father deeply, but she had Nathan and the children to help her through it, and she took comfort in knowing that George had spent his final years seeing her dreams come true. They buried him in the Verde Cemetery with a simple stone that read, "Beloved Father and Grandfather," and Sarah placed wildflowers on his grave every week. Life continued its forward march. William grew tall and serious, showing an aptitude for working with animals that made Nathan proud. Margaret developed an artistic streak, drawing and painting with whatever materials she could find, and Sarah encouraged her creativity while teaching her practical skills like sewing and cooking. More children came, though not as many as some frontier families. Another son, Robert, arrived when Margaret was 5, and a final daughter, Anne, completed their family 2 years after that. The house Nathan had built had to be expanded twice to accommodate their growing family, and the ranch prospered under his careful management. Sarah's fingers, which had once been scarred and bloodied from cactus needles, grew calloused in new ways from years of sewing with proper tools. But she never forgot those desperate days, and she made it her mission to help other women in similar circumstances. She donated sewing supplies to families who could not afford them, offered free lessons to young women trying to establish their own businesses, and created a lending library of patterns and fabrics that anyone could use. Nathan watched his wife's generosity with pride and love, seeing in her actions the same strength and resourcefulness that had first captured his heart. He built her a proper workshop as an anniversary gift, a space with large windows for natural light and custom shelving for all her supplies. The wooden sewing box from Carson City sat on a shelf of honor, its contents long since used up and replaced, but the box itself preserved as a reminder of how they had begun. On their 20th anniversary, Nathan took Sarah back to Verde's church where they had been married, just the 2 of them leaving the children with a friend for the evening. They sat in the same pew where they had spoken their vows and held hands in comfortable silence. "You ever regret it?" Sarah asked finally. "Riding 43 miles for a woman you barely knew, building a life here instead of moving on to something easier." Nathan turned to look at her, his face lined now with age and sun, but his eyes still the same storm cloud gray that had captured her attention all those years ago. "Regret it? Sarah, that ride to Carson City was the best decision I ever made. Every mile, every dollar spent, every moment since has been worth it 1,000 times over. Even the hard parts," Sarah pressed. "The lean years and the sick children and the times we have struggled. Especially the hard parts," Nathan said firmly, "because we faced them together. You are the strongest person I know, Sarah Jarrett. You took cactus needles and made them work because giving up was not in your nature. You took a 43-mile gesture and turned it into a lifetime of love and partnership. I am the lucky one in this marriage, and I thank God every day that you said yes to me. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, a familiar sensation when it came to Nathan's declarations of love. I am the lucky one. You saw me when I was invisible to everyone else. You valued me when I had nothing to offer but scars and determination. You loved me before I even knew how to love myself. They kissed there in the church, a deep kiss full of 20 years of shared history and countless more years of promise. When they finally pulled apart, Sarah rested her head on Nathan's shoulder and thought about the twisting path that had brought them here. If someone had told her on that hot August day in 1882 that the dusty cowboy riding past would become the center of her universe, she would have laughed at the impossibility. But life, she had learned, specialized in impossible things. In transforming cactus needles into sewing pins, poverty into prosperity, loneliness into love. The years continued to pass, marked by graduations and weddings and the arrival of grandchildren. William married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring county and took over increasing responsibilities on the family ranch. Margaret followed her artistic dreams to San Francisco, where she studied art and eventually opened a small gallery. Robert proved to have a head for business and helped expand their ranch's operations, while Anne became a teacher in Verdi's growing school system. Nathan's hair turned silver, and his hands grew gnarled with arthritis, but he still rose before dawn to check on his cattle and horses. Sarah's eyes required spectacles for close work, but her sewing remained as precise as ever, and she still took on special projects that interested her. They grew old together with a grace born of deep compatibility, their love maturing like good wine into something richer and more complex than it had been at the beginning. On their 40th anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a celebration that lasted an entire weekend. There was food and music and speeches that made Sarah cry and Nathan beam with pride. William presented them with a leather-bound album filled with photographs documenting their 4 decades together. Images that showed their journey from young newlyweds to middle age to the silver-haired couple they had become. Looking through the album that evening after everyone had gone home, Sarah stopped at a particular photograph from their early years. In it, she sat on the porch of their first house, holding baby William while Nathan stood behind her with his hand on her shoulder. They looked so young, she thought, so full of hope and determination. "Look at us," she said to Nathan, who was looking over her shoulder. "We had no idea what was coming, did we?" "No," Nathan agreed, "but we faced it together and that made all the difference." The wooden sewing box sat on the mantel above their fireplace now, preserved as a family heirloom. Their grandchildren knew the story by heart, how great-grandfather Nathan had ridden 43 miles to Carson City to buy sewing supplies for great-grandmother Sarah when she was using cactus needles. It had become a family legend, told and retold with embellishments that made Sarah laugh and Nathan shake his head, but the core of the story never changed. A cowboy had seen a woman in need and rode 43 miles to help her, and in doing so, he had found his heart's home. Sarah still had the first item she had sewn with the needles Nathan brought her, a simple handkerchief embroidered with her initials. She had used it on their wedding day, and she kept it tucked in the sewing box as a reminder of how far she had come. Sometimes, when she was alone, she would take it out and remember the feel of cactus needles between her fingers, the pain and desperation of those days before Nathan. Those memories were not painful anymore. They had been transformed by time and love into something precious, a reminder of her own strength and resilience, and of the unexpected ways life could turn toward joy. Nathan began to slow down in his 70s, his body finally showing the effects of decades of hard work. He handed over daily operations of the ranch to William, but still insisted on being involved in major decisions. Sarah finally retired from taking commissions, though she still sewed for pleasure and for her grandchildren, making them quilts and special garments that they would treasure long after she was gone. They spent more time together than ever, taking slow walks around the property, sitting on their porch watching the sun set, sharing memories and comfortable silences. Their love had weathered storms and celebrations, births and deaths, prosperity and hardship, and it had emerged stronger for all of it. On a warm spring evening in their 48th year of marriage, Sarah and Nathan sat together on their porch, much as they had on that first evening when Nathan had brought her the sewing box. They were older now, bent by time but not broken, and their hands were intertwined with the ease of 5 decades of practice. "You remember," Sarah said softly, "the first time you rode past here, when I was using cactus needles?" "Of course I do," Nathan replied. "I remember thinking I had never seen anyone look so determined and so tired at the same time. I remember wanting to make things easier for you." "You did more than that," Sarah said. "You gave me a life I never thought possible. You gave me love and partnership and children and grandchildren and a home that is more than just walls and a roof. You gave me everything." Nathan squeezed her hand gently. "We gave each other everything. That is what partnership means." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun painted the Nevada sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. The desert landscape they had spent their lives in transformed by the golden hour into something almost transcendent. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed and horses whinnied, the sounds of the ranch that had become their legacy. Sarah thought about the cactus needles she had used all those years ago, about the desperation and determination that had led her to such measures. She thought about the dusty cowboy who had ridden past and seen not just her poverty but her strength. She thought about the 43-mile journey he had made for a woman he barely knew, and how that journey had led to this moment, this life, this deep and abiding love. "Thank you," she said finally, turning to look at Nathan with eyes that still held all the love of their youth despite the lines that surrounded them. "For what?" he asked, though his expression suggested he knew. "For seeing me, for those needles. For 43 miles and 48 years and everything in between. For choosing me." Nathan lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Thank you for letting me choose you, for saying yes to a cowboy with more hope than sense, for building this life with me, for being the best decision I ever made." As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear, Sarah rested her head on Nathan's shoulder and felt a contentment so complete it was almost overwhelming. They had faced challenges that might have broken weaker people. They had built something solid and good from the most unlikely beginning. They had proved that love, real love, was more than just passion and romance. It was work and commitment and choosing each other every day, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. The years continued to roll forward as years do, bringing changes both welcome and sorrowful. More grandchildren arrived, and then great-grandchildren, expanding their family tree in directions Sarah and Nathan could never have imagined. The ranch prospered under William and Robert's joint management, becoming one of the most respected operations in the region. Margaret's gallery in San Francisco achieved recognition, and Anne's teaching inspired a generation of Verdi children. Sarah and Nathan became the beloved patriarch and matriarch of not just their own family, but of the entire community. People sought Nathan's advice on ranching and business matters. Sarah mentored young seamstresses and offered wisdom on marriage and motherhood. Together, they represented everything that was good about the frontier spirit: hard work, resilience, community, and love. In their mid-70s, Nathan's health began to fail more noticeably. He developed a persistent cough that worried Sarah, though he insisted it was nothing serious. She nursed him through that winter with the same devoted care she had given their children when they were sick, sitting by his bedside and reading to him when he was too tired to get up, bringing him meals and medicine, and love without measure. He recovered enough to see another spring, and they celebrated their 50th anniversary surrounded by family. It was a bittersweet celebration, everyone aware that they were marking not just the achievement of 50 years together, but also the beginning of the end of an era. Nathan gave a speech that left hardly a dry eye in the house, talking about Sarah's strength and beauty and the incredible journey they had shared. 50 years ago, he said, his voice rough with age and emotion, I rode 43 miles to buy sewing needles for a woman I barely knew. It seemed like a grand gesture at the time, but looking back, it was the smallest thing compared to what she has given me. She has given me a lifetime of love and laughter, children who make me proud, grandchildren who fill my heart with joy, and a purpose that goes beyond just existing. Sarah Dawson Jarrett, you are the best thing that ever happened to me, and I would ride 43 miles for you today, tomorrow, and every day for the rest of my life if you needed me to. Sarah wept openly, held by her husband and surrounded by the family they had created, and she thought that there could be no greater blessing than to be loved so completely, so unconditionally, for so long. Nathan passed peacefully in his sleep 2 years later, on a quiet morning in late autumn. Sarah woke to find him cold beside her, his face peaceful, and she knew with a certainty that transcended grief that he had lived a full and happy life. He had achieved his dreams, raised his children, built his ranch, and loved his wife with a devotion that had never wavered. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people from all over Nevada, people whose lives Nathan had touched in ways large and small. The service was held in Verdi's church, now much larger than the small building where they had married, and speaker after speaker rose to share stories of Nathan's kindness, his integrity, his unwavering commitment to family and community. Sarah sat through it all with dry eyes, supported by her children and grandchildren, drawing on the strength that had carried her through every hardship of her long life. She grieved deeply for the loss of her partner, her lover, her best friend, but she did not let grief consume her. Nathan would not have wanted that. He would have wanted her to celebrate the life they had shared rather than mourn its ending. After the funeral, Sarah went through Nathan's belongings with care, distributing items to children and grandchildren according to what she knew he would have wanted. She found letters he had written but never sent, journals documenting his thoughts and feelings over the decades, and tucked in the back of his closet, a faded receipt from a mercantile in Carson City, dated August 1882. She held the receipt in her trembling hands and read the itemized list of sewing supplies, the evidence of that first grand gesture that had changed both their lives. The paper was yellowed and fragile, but the writing was still legible, and Sarah could picture Nathan standing in that shop, carefully selecting each item with her in mind. She placed the receipt in the wooden sewing box alongside the embroidered handkerchief and closed the lid gently. These were the tangible reminders of a love that had been anything but tangible, a love that had been built on actions and choices and unwavering commitment. Sarah lived for another 8 years after Nathan's passing. Years she spent surrounded by family and friends, and the ranch that had been their shared dream. She was still sharp-minded and capable until nearly the end, still sewing, still offering advice, still sharing the story of the cowboy who rode 43 miles to buy her needles when she was using cactus needles to mend clothes. On her 83rd birthday, surrounded by 4 generations of the family she and Nathan had created, Sarah looked around at the faces she loved and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. From desperate poverty and cactus needles to this abundance of love and legacy, the journey had been long and sometimes difficult, but every step had been worth it. "Tell us the story again, great-grandma," one of the youngest children begged. "Tell us about the needles." So Sarah told the story one more time, her voice still strong despite her age. She told them about sitting on a porch in the summer heat of 1882, using cactus needles because she had no other choice. She told them about the dusty cowboy who rode past and saw her struggle. She told them about the 43-mile journey to Carson City and the wooden box full of sewing supplies that represented so much more than just needles and thread. "He saw me," she concluded, as she always did. "When I felt invisible, he saw me. When I felt worthless, he valued me. And when I needed help, he rode 43 miles to provide it. That is what love is, children. Not grand words or empty promises, but actions that speak louder than any poetry. Love is riding 43 miles. Love is choosing someone every day. Love is building a life together, one choice, one day, one kindness at a time." The children listened with rapt attention, and the adults wiped away tears, and Sarah felt Nathan's presence so strongly it was as if he were sitting beside her, his hand in hers, his love surrounding her like a warm blanket. When Sarah passed away peacefully in her sleep a few months later, the family buried her next to Nathan in the Verde Cemetery, under a headstone that read, "Sarah Dawson Jarrett, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother." She was strong, she was loved, she was remembered. At her funeral, William stood before the assembled crowd with the wooden sewing box in his hands. His voice was thick with emotion as he spoke of his parents' love story, of the needles and the 43-mile journey, and the 52 years of marriage that had produced not just children and grandchildren, but a legacy of love and commitment that would live on for generations. "My father once told me," William said, "that the best investment he ever made was not in cattle or land or business ventures. It was in riding 43 miles to buy sewing supplies for a woman who was using cactus needles. That investment paid dividends for 52 years, and it continues to pay dividends through all of us who are here today, all of us who exist because he made that choice, because she said yes, because they built this family together with love and determination and unwavering commitment to each other." He opened the sewing box and carefully removed the embroidered handkerchief and the faded receipt, holding them up for everyone to see. "These are the artifacts of a great love story, not the kind written in fancy words, but the kind lived in daily choices and quiet devotions. My parents taught us that love is not just a feeling but an action, not just words but deeds, not just passion but partnership." The sewing box was passed down to Margaret, who displayed it in her San Francisco gallery alongside an exhibit about frontier women and their resourcefulness. The story of Sarah's cactus needles and Nathan's 43-mile ride became part of Nevada folklore, told and retold as an example of what love looked like in the hard days of the frontier. But for those who had known Sarah and Nathan personally, who had witnessed their love firsthand, the story was about more than just a romantic gesture or frontier hardship. It was about two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built something beautiful and lasting from the most humble beginnings, who had proved that love was stronger than poverty, more enduring than hardship, and more powerful than any obstacle life could throw in their path. The ranch Nathan built continued to thrive under the management of his descendants, each generation adding their own improvements and innovations while maintaining the core values he had instilled. The sewing supplies Sarah had treasured were eventually displayed in a small museum in Verdi dedicated to preserving the town's history, and visitors came from all over to see the needles that had inspired such devotion. Years became decades, and decades became a century, and still the story persisted. It became part of family lore passed down through generations, each telling adding new details or emphasis, but always maintaining the central truth. Love, real love, was measured not in words but in actions, not in grand gestures alone but in the willingness to ride 43 miles, to choose partnership, to build a life together no matter how humble the beginning. In the hearts of those who knew the story, Sarah and Nathan lived on, forever young on that porch in Verdi, Nevada in 1882, at the moment when everything changed. She with her cactus needles and her determination, he with his kind eyes and his generous heart, both of them standing at the beginning of a love story that would outlast their lifetimes and inspire generations yet unborn. Because some love stories are written in grand gestures and dramatic moments. But the best love stories, the ones that truly endure, are written in small kindnesses and daily choices, in 43-mile rides and 52 years of partnership, in cactus needles transformed into wedding rings and poverty transformed into prosperity through the simple but profound act of choosing to love and be loved. And so, in the end, what began with cactus needles and a cowboy's compassion became something far greater, a legacy of love that proved the human capacity for transformation, for generosity, for building something beautiful from the most unpromising materials. It proved that sometimes the smallest gestures, undertaken with pure hearts, can change not just individual lives but entire family trees, entire communities, entire understandings of what love can be when it is truly lived rather than just spoken. Sarah and Nathan's story was complete, their circle closed, their love story having reached its natural conclusion. They had lived fully, loved deeply, and left behind a legacy that would endure far beyond their mortal years. From cactus needles to sewing pins, from poverty to prosperity, from loneliness to belonging, they had traveled together, hand in hand, heart to heart, proving that the best happily ever afters are not the ones where everything is perfect from the beginning, but the ones where two imperfect people choose to build something perfect together, one day, one choice, one act of love at a time. Their story had ended, but its echoes would continue forever, inspiring others to see past surface poverty to inner strength, to value actions over words, to understand that the greatest journeys often begin with the simplest decisions to help someone in need. 43 miles had become infinity, and cactus needles had become the foundation of an empire of love that would never truly end as long as someone, somewhere, remembered to tell the story of the seamstress and the cowboy who loved her enough to ride any distance, face any hardship, choose her every day for the rest of his life.